A woman stood motionless as fabric tore and buttons scattered across marble floors. Her humiliation meant to be absolute, but the paper trembling in her hand held a truth that would transform shame into power in seconds. No one in that glittering hall suspected that the woman they were watching fall apart actually controlled everything they were about to hear. The conference hall's pristine silence shattered like crystal. His voice sliced through conversations, through laughter, through the gentle clinking of champagne glasses. Every head turned, every conversation died. The acoustics of the grand chamber amplified his words until they seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Strip away that pretense," he commanded, his tone dripping with contempt. "You want to stand among us? Prove it. Speak in Arabic right now, or admit you're an imposter." Before Amara could process what was happening, his hand moved with shocking violence. Fingers closed around the delicate buttons of her tailored white blouse and yanked. The sound was terrible, intimate, final. Each button hit the polished floor with a distinct ping, scattering in different directions like her dignity being thrown to the wind. The white fabric gaped open, exposing her camisole beneath, exposing her vulnerability to hundreds of eyes. Amara, a young black woman who had spent weeks preparing for this moment, stood paralyzed. The fluorescent chandeliers above seemed to brighten, spotlighting her humiliation. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, each breath a struggle against the weight of what had just happened. She could feel the stares like physical pressure, hundreds of them, pressing against her skin, her chest, her face, suffocating her where she stood. The man who had torn her clothing wore an expensive suit, the kind that whispered of old money and older power. His face twisted into something cruel, a smirk that spoke of a lifetime of never being challenged, never being told no, never facing consequences. He was convinced he had just put someone in her place, reduced her to nothing more than a cautionary tale for anyone else who might dare to reach beyond their station. But none of them, not a single person in that room full of diplomats and officials and self-important bureaucrats, noticed what Amara clutched in her trembling hands. The papers pressed against her palm were damp now with sweat, edges creasing, but the official seal embossed in gold remained visible to anyone who bothered to look. No one was looking. They were all too busy watching her suffer. The whispers started like wind through dry grass, soft at first, then growing. Amara's face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She could feel each whisper as if it were being carved into her skin. Around her, the crowd became a living thing, shifting, judging, condemning. Some people deliberately turned their backs, as though her humiliation might somehow contaminate them by proximity, as though shame were contagious, as though by witnessing what was being done to her, they might somehow become complicit unless they looked away. Others stared openly, their eyes bright with a terrible curiosity. They watched her the way people watch accidents, unable to look away from suffering that isn't theirs to bear. Their expressions ranged from pity to disgust to something worse, satisfaction. They waited for her to break down, to cry, to run from the room with her torn shirt clutched around her. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse. Amara's hands moved automatically, trying to pull the ruined fabric together, trying to cover herself, trying to gather some semblance of dignity from the wreckage. But the buttons were scattered across the floor now, irretrievable, and the shirt gaped no matter how tightly she held it. The exposure wasn't just physical, it was psychological, spiritual. She stood there feeling more naked than if she had actually been unclothed, because this wasn't her choice. This was violation masquerading as verification. A woman standing nearby, dripping in pearls and privilege, leaned toward her companion. Her voice was meant to be quiet, but in the awful silence of the hall, it carried. "She doesn't even belong in this building," the woman said, her tone thick with disdain. "I don't know who thought it was appropriate to let someone like her into a summit of this caliber." Those words landed like blows, harder than the physical assault of torn fabric. They cut deeper, because they spoke to something beyond this moment, beyond this humiliation. They spoke to a belief system, a worldview that saw Amara as fundamentally lesser, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally out of place no matter what she wore or how she spoke or what credentials she carried. Amara tried to control her breathing, tried to find some center of calm in the storm of shame swirling around her. But the silence was not peaceful. It was predatory, hungry, waiting to devour any sign of weakness. The chandelier lights blurred as tears formed in her eyes, uninvited and unwelcome. She blinked hard, refusing to let them fall, refusing to give these people that satisfaction. In a polished silver tray on a nearby table, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. The image shocked her. Her hair, so carefully styled that morning, was disheveled. Her shirt hung open despite her attempts to hold it closed. Her face showed everything she was trying to hide, the fear, the shame, the crushing weight of isolation. She looked exactly how they wanted her to look, broken, diminished, defeated. The man took a step closer, invading what little personal space she had left. His cologne was expensive and overwhelming. His presence was a threat and a promise. "Translate for us," he demanded, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never been denied anything. "Do it now, or admit what everyone here already knows, that you're worthless, that you're a fraud, that you have no business being here." In that crystallized moment, Amara felt the full, crushing weight of complete isolation. She was alone in a room packed with people. Not one voice rose in her defense. Not one person stepped forward to intervene. Not one hand reached out to help her gather her buttons, to offer a jacket to cover her exposed shirt, to simply acknowledge that what was happening was wrong. Instead, there were only eyes, watching, judging, assessing, calculating whether she was really worth defending, whether standing up for her would cost them too much socially or professionally or politically. And in their silence, in their calculated neutrality, they had already made their choice. She was expendable. She was acceptable collateral damage in whatever power game was being played. Amara's fingers tightened around the papers she held, knuckles turning white with the pressure. It was a tiny act of defiance, perhaps the only one she had left. Her voice, when she tried to speak, came out as barely more than a whisper, already defeated. What would any of them do if this happened to them? Would they stand there and take it? Or would they have the luxury of knowing someone would defend them? The man's laughter cracked through the hall like a gunshot. It was a sound of pure triumph, of unassailable victory. "You see," he announced to the room, turning slightly to include the audience in his performance, "she can't even form words unless we give her permission. She can't speak unless we command her to speak. This is what happens when people are allowed into spaces they haven't earned." His words were not just insults. They were shackles, chains, iron bars constructing a cage around her identity and her humanity. He was not just attacking her, he was providing a framework for how everyone else in the room should see her. He was defining reality, and in his version, she was less than human. A few people in the crowd chuckled nervously, a sound that made Amara's stomach turn. They were eager to align themselves with power, to be on the winning side, to make sure everyone knew they agreed with the man who was clearly in control. Their laughter was permission, encouragement, fuel for the fire consuming her dignity. Amara's knees trembled. For one terrible heartbeat, she thought she might actually collapse right there on the marble floor, crumpling like the discarded buttons scattered around her feet. The weight of their collective judgment was too much, the pressure too intense, the humiliation too complete. "Say it!" the man pressed, his voice louder now, filling the entire hall. "In Arabic, right now. Show every person here that you're not a complete fraud. Prove you have any right at all to be standing in this building." He was turning her humanity into entertainment, her dignity into a circus act. He was demanding she perform her worth, prove her value, justify her very existence to an audience that had already decided she had none. The demand itself was designed to be impossible because no matter what she did, no matter what she said, it would never be enough. The game was rigged from the start. Amara's fingers, still clutched around those papers, began to relax slightly. Her thumb brushed across one corner of the document, feeling the raised texture of an embossed seal. The International Conference Secretariat official insignia, the kind of marking that appeared on exactly one type of document, the kind that only a very specific, very small group of people would ever be authorized to carry. As she lifted her chin, something shifted in her posture. The trembling in her knees stopped. Her voice, when it came, was cracked and raw, but it carried across the room. "Do you even understand what you're asking me?" The man scoffed, his confidence unshaken. "I'm asking you to prove you're not a fraud. I'm asking you to demonstrate you have any legitimate right to stand in this hall. Is that really so difficult to understand?" That was when Amara unfolded the packet. Slowly, deliberately. She held it up so the light from the chandeliers caught the gold-embossed seal, making it gleam. The official letterhead of the conference secretariat became visible, unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Gasps rippled through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Understanding spread from person to person, faces changing as realization struck. She was not a guest. She was not an attendee hoping to network and make connections. She was not some random person who had wandered into a space above her station. She was the official conference translator, the one hired by the Secretariat itself, the one personally vetted and approved to handle every single word spoken from the main stage, the one who controlled the entire linguistic framework of the summit. Without her, the delegates from 14 different countries would not understand each other. Without her, the entire multi-million-dollar conference would collapse into chaos. The man staggered backward as if the papers had delivered a physical blow, harder and more devastating than any punch. His face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed without sound. You're the translator." The words came out strangled, disbelieving, horrified. Amara stepped forward, and despite her torn shirt, despite the buttons scattered across the floor, despite the tears that had blurred her vision moments ago, she had never looked more powerful. "I'm not here to entertain you," she said, her voice steady now, sharp as a blade. "I'm not here to prove myself to you. I am here because without me, not a single one of you would understand a word spoken on that stage tonight." But the crowd shifted, bodies turning, eyes widening, as the full weight of the truth settled over them like a heavy blanket. The same mouths that had mocked her, that had laughed at her humiliation, that had whispered about her unworthiness, now hung open in stunned, mortified silence. Amara let Arabic words flow from her mouth, smooth and flawless, the classical formal dialect used in diplomatic settings. She spoke with the precision of someone who had mastered the language not just conversationally, but academically, professionally, at the highest levels. Her pronunciation was perfect, her grammar impeccable, her command of the idioms and nuances absolute. Then, switching back to English without pause, she delivered her final strike. "You wanted me to prove my worth. You wanted me to demonstrate I belong here. Consider it done. And now let me make something else very clear. Every word spoken from that stage tonight passes through me. Every statement, every negotiation, every carefully crafted diplomatic phrase depends entirely on my interpretation. So perhaps you should have thought twice before deciding I was worthless." The man's smirk had vanished completely, replaced with a humiliation that weighed on him visibly, bowing his shoulders, draining the arrogance from his posture. He had tried to reduce her to nothing, and instead he had exposed his own ignorance, his own cruelty, his own fundamental misunderstanding of power and worth. But Amara was not done. She turned to address the room, speaking to every person who had watched her suffer without intervening. I have interpreted for presidents and prime ministers. I have translated peace negotiations and trade agreements. I have spent 15 years mastering 7 languages to professional fluency. My credentials were reviewed by a committee of 12 senior diplomats before I was approved for this position. And tonight, all of you will depend on my skills, my accuracy, my professionalism. The same skills you just watched someone try to humiliate me for claiming to have. The silence that followed was different from before. This was not the predatory silence of people waiting for someone to break. This was the uncomfortable silence of shame, of people being forced to confront their own complicity, their own cowardice, their own willingness to watch injustice without acting. Amara bent down and picked up one of the scattered buttons, holding it in her palm. "This," she said quietly, "is what you thought would break me. A torn shirt, a public humiliation, the assumption that I do not belong." She closed her fingers around the button. But dignity is not something you can tear away from someone. It is something they carry inside themselves, and mine is still intact. She turned and walked toward the conference room, her torn shirt forgotten, her head high, her papers clutched firmly in her hand. Behind her, the crowd remained frozen, the weight of what they had witnessed and failed to prevent settling over them like ash.